Have you ever tracked a buck before that was just so large that the image of its track is just burned into your mind? And it doesn't have to be tracking, it can be any way that you pursue a whitetail. And I'm not just talking about a big whitetail, I'm talking like a giant whitetail. Every now and then you come across a track that, for me, it just, oh my word, it can almost make me nauseous. You just get so, just does something to my head. That track will be so vivid in my mind. And that's exactly what happened back in 2006. I tracked a buck that, it was by far the largest deer that I've ever tracked. And again, it wasn't a buck that was like, oh, it's a big deer. It was like, man, this thing's a giant. So I do have to be completely honest about something before I get too far into this video. So the deer that's in this thumbnail is a huge buck. It's not the buck I tracked in 2006. The deer that's in the thumbnail was actually a deer from 2012 that had come by one of our trail cameras the night I was actually driving home to come home and go hunt. I was driving home from college and that deer had crossed that camera that night. I get to the camp that night and Dad's like, I've checked the cameras and there was nothing on them. And we get out that morning and that's the first camera we check and boom, you look at that image of that buck and it just, oh man, it makes you almost, it's a feeling that's so hard to articulate. It's like, man, that's a big deer. So yeah, I wanted to call attention to that. That's a huge buck. That's just how elusive whitetails are. That deer showed up from nowhere. Never saw it again, and we didn't have any tracking snow, so we couldn't track it. But that was a big buck. When I see a huge track that I'm tracking, and I don't just mean big, I mean something that's like, it doesn't happen very often. Maybe once every 5 or 6 years, you come across a track that's just like, oh my God, that's a big deer. And that's what happened in 2006. We were hunting in an area that was quite a ways away from my home. It was about a 2.5 hour drive. It was a good poke. And it was handy to where our deer camp was. So I wanted to get up earlier in the year. We go to deer camp Thanksgiving week, and I wanted to get up and do some hunting earlier in the year in this area. There was a few pockets of deer there the year before, and I kind of want to get an idea of what's going on and what's hanging out for deer. So my father-in-law, we make a plan. We're going to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and drive up so we can get up there before light. We got snow that night, so we're going to kind of see what's going on, see if we can find a deer track. He had never tracked deer before. His type of hunting is field hunting, so this was going to give him some exposure to getting out in the woods. So it was more of a scouting mission, see what we could turn up. So we get into the place where we want to hunt, and we're hitting some different roads, and we come down one road and there's a beautiful buck. I get out and there's a beautiful buck track crossing, and he's actually crossing the road twice. So we got to figure out which way did he go, which way is his most recent. So we get to the end of this road, and at the end of this road it was blocked off, and there was an old winter road that kind of went in, I don't know, a couple hundred yards, and then probably banged to the right at a 90-degree angle and went probably a mile in a straight line. You couldn't drive it. So what I did is I see that deer going, we're coming down the road, and I see that deer's track going down to the right and then coming back across the road. So is he down to the right or is he up to the left? We got to figure out which way was his most recent track. So I figured, well, I'm going to park the truck there. This road curls way in, down, and around. I'm just going to walk that road real quick. I can do it pretty quick, and I can get down there and check. And I'm pretty certain if he had gone down into that area, he was probably going to come out across that road. That's typically what the deer did in this area. So I go down the road and I walk all the way to the end of that road, almost in a jog. And I get down there, nothing had crossed. So I come all the way back out and we pick up the track going back up away from that side. So we get on the deer track and we just get going. And we come to a spot where he had hung out with some does for quite a while. And this buck track is huge. I was telling my father-in-law, I'm like, you know, and granted, this is his first time ever doing this kind of hunting. And so I'm telling my father-in-law, you know, if he stays with these does, we got a good chance of freshening this up and catching up to him. So we continue on the track and we come into some thick stuff, and the deer ends up leaving these other deer. And he's off by himself at this point. And we start to come up a little ravine, and it's quite thick. And I was telling my father-in-law, I'm like, I think we're getting pretty close. I think we freshened it up quite a bit. And I just come up this little ravine, and I come out into the end of a skid trail, and I can see off to the right, just down off to the skid trail, that deer had stood for quite a while and had kind of pranced back and forth. And I looked at my father-in-law, and I'm like, he stood here for quite a while. I'm like, I think he heard us coming. And you could see where he stood and waited and waited and waited. And there was no tracks running from where he stood. So we were up on this little landing on this skid road, And you could see probably a couple hundred yards down the skid road. There's raspberry bushes and stuff and whatnot in it. So I tell my father-in-law, stay up on this skid road. I'm gonna step down into the woods right here where this deer had stood for quite a while. Just keep an eye down the skid road. And I just stepped down into where that deer had been standing, and I'm kind of looking around, just kind of figure out, you know, what's going on here. And there's walking tracks going from it. And just on the other side of some trees from Maine, I hear a buck take off. And it's this undeniable sound of just like heavy hooves on the ground. Nothing breaking, but it's just a heavy animal taking off. That buck, I turn around and look at my father-in-law. My father-in-law is standing on the skid trail, and he just goes. So according to my father-in-law, he had his gun slung. Like I mentioned, he's not familiar with this type of hunting. Things happen real quick. You know, you kind of got to get used to that. If you've never done it before, you really don't know what to expect. So his gun was slung over his shoulder. And when I stepped down into the woods, that deer broke off to the left, jumped out into the skid trail, stopped, froze, and looked over at him. And he said maybe it was, I don't know, probably to him it felt like an eternity, but it was a few seconds. He just froze, looked at the deer, and didn't even get his gun off his shoulder. So I come back up and I'm like, what happened? He's like, he just kept saying, big buck, big buck. And he said, the horns on it, he said, very wide, dark, and he said the tips were very white. The deer wasn't far away from him. It was within 50 yards, so it was just a chip shot. And the deer took off. And so my father-in-law was a chewer at the time. So I'm like, hey, we're gonna let him chill here for 20, 30 minutes. We'll just hang out here, have a snack. So, you know, we're kind of laughing, it's like, okay, good, we're into some deer, and this is a big buck. And he thought it was awesome just to get that close, to see a big buck that close out in the woods. He was pretty tickled. So we're just kind of sitting there shooting the crap, and we're kind of laughing because when we started on this deer back up by the road, a guy comes up the road. He's like, hey, you boys tracking a deer? And we're like, yeah. And he's like, you're going the wrong way on it. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I just want to see where he's coming from. I mean, we weren't going the wrong way. So we were kind of chuckling. We were like, yeah, going the wrong way on the deer. Well, we caught up to it, so I don't know how that worked out. But anyway, so we hung out there for 20, 30 minutes. And I'm like, look, he'll probably settle down, go a couple hundred yards if that, and he'll wait for us, see what's going on. And I've always found, and I think my father would disagree with me on this, we've kind of had some debates back and forth, but I feel like big bucks are actually easier to track than small bucks. And hear me out, I'll explain why. A lot of the small bucks, the mediocre bucks that I track, it seems like once you jump them up, man, they're gone. It's like their goal is to put as much distance between you and them. I don't know how many times I've tracked a small buck that once you jump them up, it's like game over. It's like they are out of the country. You can never seem to catch them. However, every large buck that I've tracked, you jump them up and it's almost like they're like, nah, I'm not really. I just want to see what's behind me. I'll just go a little bit here and wait around. I'm kind of curious what's coming behind me. They don't really put more effort into it than what they need to get away. And I mean, eventually, you know, if you drive them hard enough, they'll up and run, but they'll usually hang around and let you see them. And sometimes a couple times. I mean, that's what I've come across. I think my father, you'll kind of disagree, but I'm going to stick with the fact that larger deer are actually easier to track. Older bucks, big bucks are easier to track than young, mediocre, small bucks. So anyway, we sit there, we shoot the crap for a little bit, and so I don't know, 20 minutes goes by, and they're like, all right, we'll sneak down around here. Just like we said, walk up on that skid trail, pick up his track, and he went basically the next skid trail over, and there was a pretty good block of woods in between those two skid trails. Goes the next skid trail over, I looked down the skid trail, and there was a blowdown. This skid trail kind of did an S away from us, and right on that corner that was kind of going away and around to the right, there was a blowdown on that corner. He was on the other side of that blowdown standing there. And the minute I come through the woods and I look up, I could just see horn coming out the side, and he takes off. And I think I fired twice at him. And again, it was just a snapshot, just real quick, and didn't cut hair, didn't get him. And then he did the typical tricks. We get into some jack firs, and he went in, out, back across, and he had us going all through there the rest of the afternoon. So we had a long drive out that night. and it was getting late eventually. Once we sorted everything out, it's like, you know what, we're gonna leave it alone. I'm coming back up next weekend. I'm coming right back in here. There's a pocket of does and I'm coming right back in here. This is an easy deer to track. I can identify his track in 2 seconds if he's in here. So we fast forward a week and we go up to deer camp. So a week later, we're at camp and it's Sunday night and we're gonna figure out what we're gonna do the next day. And my father says, Paul, where are you going in? And I said, I'm going right back into that spot. There's a pocket of does in there. And this buck, when we tracked him the week before, his track was all through there. And he kind of just kept doing a loop in around there. I'm like, I bet you I can go up in there and pick up his track in no time. We head out and we go in and park the same spot that we parked the week before. I make a beeline and it was good walking and I could cover some ground and I start heading in the woods. And I think we went 20 minutes, 30 minutes, come up over a little knoll and I look in front of me about 30 feet. I'm like, that's his track right there. And we walk over and my God, it's like I said, it's burned into my mind to this day. It just makes your stomach roll. My father was just shook his head. He's like, man, that's a big deer. But man, it was, like I said, you could fit 4 fingers in that track. It was a giant buck. So we get on it that morning and he's just meandering around and sure enough, he hooks up with a doe. So we're thinking, oh, perfect. This is money. We're in the game now. He's with a doe. We're going to get him. And we went a couple hours and we come to the edge of a cut. And out in this cut, there was a hill out in the middle of it. My father's like, there's a doe going up through the cut. And you could see her snaking her way up through the cut. And you're thinking, panic sets in. You're thinking, the buck is right here somewhere. He's with her. So it was the darndest thing. She disappeared over the top of that hill. He's like, where the heck is that buck? He's here somewhere. And so I stayed with the doe and Dad followed the buck's tracks. And that buck had gone, when we came to that cut, that buck had worked his way around the entire edge of that cut and snuck around the backside of that hill. And we never saw him. He stayed just on the other side where we couldn't see him as that doe went right up the middle of the cut. And as I come up over the knoll, I see Dad coming down around this way and just shaking our heads. And so they met right back up and off they went. And so we continued on that deer and they stayed right together. And we ended up doing an entire loop that day, right back to almost where we started. So at this point, it's early afternoon and they haven't slowed down, haven't caught up to them, but they're just walking. Pretty soon we come to a spot where there's some more skid trails. And there's a big blowdown. It's one of those blowdowns that you just can't step over. It was high enough, it's about chest high, but it was a big thick log and it was very hard to get under, very hard to get over. So I get down on the ground, I put my gun on the other side actually. And I get down on the ground and I just go to sneak in. I'm getting underneath the sticks and stuff on the back are kind of catching on your coat and whatnot. And you're trying to get in underneath it. And I just get in underneath that blowdown and I go to stand up. Just off to the right of the skid trail, there's some mature growth woods that have been selectively cut, and underneath that mature growth softwoods, there was all kinds of jack firs. And I see 2 tails going through these jack firs. So I stand up and I pull up, and I can't see the deer hardly at all. I can just see their tails every time they jump up in the air. And pretty soon the doe comes out across that skid trail about 7,500 yards away. And I pull up and I'm like, that buck's gonna be right behind her. And I pull up, and what does that buck do? He goes all the way down, maybe another 50 yards past where that doe crossed, and he crosses just on the end of that skid trail in the woods. And it was a Hail Mary because he was in the woods, and fired once at him, hit a tree about that big around down in there where he was. Yeah, it would have been a lucky shot if I would have connected with him. I never did get to see his rack really good, when you're tracking and deer running and jumping and you're just seeing bits and parts, and you just see antler, you really don't know how big it is. But I do remember seeing the neck on him and chest as he came out across that skid trail. Man, that was a big deer. That was probably by far the largest buck I'd ever tracked. And that track is ingrained in my mind. It is so vivid to this day. I think about it every fall. I'm like, man, I'd like to come across another one like that. And they're few and far between. And there's a reason why that buck was as big as he was. He was tough. He was in the right places at all the right times. Yeah, so I missed that deer not once, but I missed it twice. that season. And man, it killed me. But hey, that's deer hunting. It's fun. We had a blast doing it. My father-in-law had a blast. You know, he saw the biggest deer he's ever seen that close. He was pretty much sold on tracking that day. He was like, man, it almost made it seem like it was too easy. You know, it was one day, a few hours, go in, boom, there's a nice buck. And it doesn't always happen that way, but every now and then, you know, you get a little lucky. So I got 2 chances at that deer that year and couldn't seem to pull it off. But anyway, it was good times. The rest of that week wasn't really any good tracking. We got some more snow and then rain, and then it got really cold, and then we had about 12 inches of snow with a thick crust on it, and it was so hard to get through the woods. You would basically just get up on top of the crust and break through, get up on top of the crust and break through. And it makes for a long day, stepping up, breaking through, stepping up, breaking through. Needless to say, that deer lived to see hopefully another hunting season. Never found him again to track him. So, you know, and I really enjoy reminiscing about past deer hunts. It can put you right back in that moment. You can basically relive it. And every time you share it with someone, you know, they may learn something from your experience that they can carry on into their own hunt. Yeah, it helps pass the time, and it helps kind of keep you going for next deer season. So in the meantime, you know, get outside. It's good for the soul. See ya.